Well, dear students, I'm not sure how this is going to work, but I will do my best, and I hope there is somebody else there at the other end listening to my lecture. So if you're out there, you can actually leave a note in the chat, and I will be able to see it. I can't hear you. I don't think I have any feedback from you, but at least I'll be able to know that you are there. Also, of course, you can follow the link apparently later, and you can still listen to the presentation. Okay, good. I see the first person. Hooray, you're out there. Right, listen to me. So, все, там есть. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the functional styles in the English language. This is the second half of our course, and I do need to give you some information. I apologize for this late start, but at least you're all there. I can see your comments coming up in the chat. If I am too fast for you, please let me know. Also, there have been some questions about the stylistic devices, so please give me some time. I'm trying to figure out how to handle the situation when you're all doing this distance learning, and I'm not quite sure yet how to organize the checking of those stylistic devices, but I'll come back to you, so don't worry, right? I'm not leaving you alone. I am I'm still there. Okay, when you say the quality is low, can you tell me what you mean? Is it not loud enough? Are there pauses or what? I'm mostly concerned about the sound, not the picture. It doesn't really matter what you say. It's basically what you can hear. So I will try to speak slowly, and I will be repeating myself. I can see that there are pauses. Unfortunately, not everything. Okay, right. Okay, well, I can't guarantee that all you have good quality reception, but as I said, I will try to speak slowly, although we only have about an hour left now. Right, let me just grab my coffee just in case, my throat gets rather dry. Right. Okay, and I'm back, and my coffee is back, so please listen. So, the history of research into functional styles begins in 1925. Right. Okay, don't comment on every phrase, please, right? Don't interrupt me now. Right, so the history of research into functional style begins, as I said, in 1925, when a Russian researcher called Professor Vinokur differentiated functionally motivated language systems. So he differentiated the so-called functionally motivated language systems, such as colloquial, poetic, bell letter, scientific, and newspaper. So colloquial, poetic, bell letter, scientific, and newspaper. Bell letter style is the French name. The word's of French origin. The spelling is B-E-L-L-E-S. That is if you don't do French, right? B-E-L-L-E-S. And the second word is L-E-T-T-R-E-S. Bell letter. And of course, as you know, the French do not pronounce half the sounds or half the letters which they write. However, the initiator of the research into functional styles is believed to be the so-called Prague Linguistic Group. So Prague Linguistic Group was the academic school which started serious research into functional styles. As you know, some Russian scholars joined the Prague Linguistic Group in the 1920s and in the 1930s. The first researcher who used the term functional style was Havranek. in the Russian spelling, his name is Havranek. Havranek, Havranek. So he was the first to use the term functional style. Later, himself, he changed it. He talked about functional dialect. But that was his own idea and not really relevant for our research. So, how did he define functional styles? This is a quotation from one of his papers, which was written in 1932. He said the following, and I quote, "The language means which function as instruments for stylistic purposes, the language means which function as instruments for stylistic purposes constitute only a specific means of organization of concrete utterances." So once again, the language means which function as instruments for stylistic purposes constitute only a specific manner of organization of concrete utterances. And this is the end of quote. The quote is by Havranek, and the paper it comes from was published in 1932. What he meant was that same words could be rearranged to form different styles. So the same words can be rearranged to form different styles. In other words, he was saying that languages do not have special restricted systems devoted or used only by one specific functional styles. These language systems were quite flexible. Another researcher from the Prague Linguistic Group or Prague Linguistic Circle, Mathesius, and if you remember, we mentioned him when we spoke about the notion of style and the research into stylistics. Also, a member of this group, as I said, in 1942, focused on the research into the bell letter style. And at the time, he stressed the difference between the individual, inimitable style of a creative artist. So he stressed the difference between the individual, inimitable style of a creative artist and the inter-individual and more highly conventionalized styles. The second half was, and the inter-individual and more highly conventionalized styles. So we can see that he opposed the bell letter style to other styles. And this contrast, this opposition, can be found in some modern schools of thought as well. And there is discussion, sometimes continuing, between researchers as to whether we should consider the bell letter style a functional style at all, or should we study anything else besides the bell letter style. There are researchers in the Russian academic tradition who believe that the bell letter style is not a functional style. We'll talk about this later today, hopefully, when we talk about the classification of different functional styles. until reasonably recently, in the Western tradition, there was an opinion that, on the contrary, only the bell letter style should be researched within stylistics. But I would say in general, both positions are not followed much these days, and basically all modifications of language variation are presented within the stylistic research. Okay, anyway, so that was the history of research into functional styles. And our next point that we're going to look at now is the two principal approaches to the research into functional style. We have, first of all, the functional approach, and secondly, we have the variation approach. And I'm going to start with the functional approach, first of all, because it's much more developed, and secondly, because the Prague linguistic circle also belongs to the functional approach. Within the functional approach, we can single out two models. We have the monofunctional model and the polyfunctional model. And we will start with the monofunctional model. Monofunctional model has two sub-varieties. Those who belong to the first variety believe that one function is characteristic of one functional style. So one function corresponds to one functional style. In the second submodel within this monofunctional approach, one function is believed to be characteristic of several styles. Okay, so one function can be characteristic of a number of styles. The supporter of this one functional style approach was Professor Galperin. And when he spoke about his classification of functional styles, he basically identified them by the function which the functional styles before. I will start with the definition of the functional style as suggested by Professor Galperin. Within his approach, he spoke about functional styles, and actually I should say that it is quite common to abbreviate functional style as FS, capital letters, very handy. So for him, functional style is a system of interrelated language means which serves a definite aim in communication. A system of interrelated language means which serves a definite aim in communication. You see that the verb agrees with the word system, not means. Okay, hence we have the third person singular verb. Another supporter of the monofunctional model was academician Vinogradov. Within his system of functional styles, he singled out 3 functions and 5 functional styles. So the functions were as follows. He spoke about the communicative function, the informative function, and the pragmatic function. So the communicative function, the informative function, and the pragmatic function. When the communicative function was at work, in his classification of functional styles, that brought about the style of conversation. So the communicative function brought about the style of conversation. The informative function brought about two functional styles. The first one is scientific prose, and the second is the style of official documents. So, scientific prose and the style of official documents. Although, of course, you can see that different kinds of information will be given in each variety, right, within each functional style. Again, we'll talk about these functional styles separately. And thirdly, the pragmatic function also brought about two functional styles. The first one was called the journalese. The journalese, you can see the same suffix as in the words Chinese, Japanese, Congolese, and so on and so forth. In other classifications, this functional style might have a different name. And in some situations, you may even include, you can separate it into two specific functional styles. And the second functional style brought about by the pragmatic function will be the bell-letter style. Please remember the spelling. So the bell-letter style. Okay, so 3 functions, 5 functional styles. Okay, so this completes the presentation of the monofunctional approach, and we have to move on to the polyfunctional approach. Within the polyfunctional approach, the same functions are inherent in different styles. So the same functions are inherent in different styles, although I would say the functions are present in varying degrees, in different degrees. Again, we have quite a number of prominent researchers representing this approach. The first one will be Yuri Stepanov, and the second one is Professor Schweitzer. So Yuri Stepanov and Professor Schweitzer, two also quite prominent figures within the linguistic research. So what we have here is, we will start maybe with the definition which is given by Yuri Stepanov to describe what a functional style is, right? And it's a rather lengthy definition, so we'll try to deliver it by sections, and obviously I'll be repeating certain parts of the definition, though you can write them down. Okay. Now, so he said, he described a functional style as a historically developed and socially cognized is COGNIZED, cognized subsystem within the system of a national language. So it's a historically developed and socially cognized subsystem within the system of a national language, assigned, 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 it's a verb, right? Assigned to certain communicative situations, in brackets, speech situations, and characterized by a set of means of expression, and the underlying principles of their selection from the national language. Okay, so once again, the whole definition. So the functional style is a historically developed and socially cognized subsystem within the system of a national language assigned to certain communicative situations or speech situations and characterized by a set of means of expression and the underlying principles of their selection from the national language. So that was the definition proposed by Yuri Stepanov. Professor Schweitzer described functional styles as not a particular speech situation, but a class of such situations, or in other words, a communicative domain. So it is not a particular speech situation, but a class of social speech situations, or in other words, a communicative domain. Okay, so that was the understanding of the functional style within the polyfunctional approach. Right, now, do I need to repeat anything? Or are you okay with Professor Stepanov's definition? You can drop me a line if you want in the chat, if you have a chance. Okay, whereas I can sip my coffee. Okay, lovely. I'm not sure what draconian law means by no nerve too. Right, okay. Anyway, let's move on. So now the second variation approach. Variation approach is also represented by a number of prominent researchers. Okay, right. It's okay. Right, I guess there is a bit of a difficulty with spelling, but otherwise, I guess we can move on. So we have the second approach, which is the variation approach. Again, as I said, a number of prominent researchers represented here. And in particular, the first name, which I'm going to mention, is that of Niels Erik Enquist. Again, I hope you remember him from our initial lectures on stylistics. He did not give a specific definition to the functional style. He spoke about functional style in different papers that he wrote, and in these papers he described functional style as a kind of linguistic variation, in another paper it was conditioned variation, and in still another paper functional styles were described as fuzzy sets of texts. And I'm going to say a few words about this last point that he made, the fuzzy sets of text, because I do like the word fuzzy, and it shows a very interesting approach to research into functional styles. Fuzzy means usually something that does not have clear borders, clearly visible borders. What Enquist means is that when we look at different texts, we can always find something that will be a better example of a certain functional style. probably would have more characteristics, would be a more typical representative of a certain functional style. And such texts would form the central core of the category of a certain functional style. Whereas since we have to ensure the communication, and of course we're all individual people, and we all have individual target audiences, we may end up with texts which only possess a certain percentage of characteristics typical of a certain functional style. And such texts which maybe lack certain features typical of a certain functional style will not be found in the core of the category. They will tend towards the periphery. They might even include certain features typical of a different functional style. For example, if you think about this, it's very difficult to draw a border between popular scientific texts, for example, and informative essays. Because both aim at communicating general information to general public, people without any specialized knowledge in a certain field. And obviously, there is a considerable difference between, for example, popular scientific text, and scientific text proper. You know it from your own experiences. It's very easy to read popular scientific texts and not very easy to read proper scientific texts. They are intended for a very educated audience, the audience which is well aware of the conventions and corresponding terminology, and even the underlying research in certain fields. So the authors will need to sacrifice some of the most typical features of academic writing in order to reach a broader audience. Otherwise, people will just get confused or bored, or they will fail to understand the text and they will not be able to read it anyway. So fuzzy sets of text do exist, and obviously with the development of language, this trend can continue. People can borrow different kinds of means from one variety of text into another variety of text. Okay, the second researcher within the variation approach is Professor Nair. We spell in English Naer. As you know, again, I mentioned him before. He was a student of Professor Galperin, and both of them worked in our department of stylistics, so of course we have to mention him. He also gave a definition to the functional style, and again I'm going to dictate this particular definition. So he described it as a socially recognized and functionally conditioned model of systematic linguistic variation. Socially recognized and functionally conditioned model of systematic linguistic variation. So you see that for him, functional style is not a text, it's a model of variation. But this model of variation is governed by certain principles. It has to perform certain functions, and it also has to be recognized by society. If you remember when we spoke about stylistics at the beginning, we said that for style to be established irrespective of content, we have to see the same patterns time and time again. So the same works for the functional styles. We have to see certain patterns repeated more than once. And these models can draw on linguistic resources, and as the result, we get the understanding of what a certain functional style is, to what extent it can vary, how far we can move from the core to the periphery before we move into a different functional style. Okay, right. So that was all I had to say about the approach to the functional style. And our next topic is the conditioning factors of functional styles. So the conditioning factors of functional styles. And we can single out 4 factors. So the first one is the aim of communication, or sometimes called function. So the aim of communication or function. The second factor is the sphere of communication or communicative domain. So the sphere of communication or communicative domain. The third factor which brings about functional styles is socio-cultural development. Socio-cultural development. Here we can talk about historical development, political, economic, technological, and so on. So there are different parameters or different aspects of the socio-cultural development of a certain society, and consequently the language means which this society uses. Well, just to give you an example, well, first of all, of course, you know that not all functional styles appeared at the same time. I will mention that later again, but one of the most recent functional styles, surprisingly, was the newspaper style or the news style. Why? Because society did not need mass media until reasonably recently. For quite a few years, news and information would be disseminated not through the newspapers, but through other means. Personal communication, special couriers which would deliver information, I don't know, gossip, popular gossip, lots of other channels of communication were available for as long as there was no need for quick dissemination of information. And only when we developed the need to receive the latest information as quickly as possible, the newspapers began to appear and the whole functional style was eventually formed. The same can be said about scientific research. Again, obviously science was being developed. There were scientists, they were doing research, they were sharing information. But interestingly enough, one of the first genres within scientific research, within the scientific prose style, would be personal correspondence. Basically, scientists wrote letters to either each other describing their discoveries or to some kind of academic societies or scientific societies, and they shared their discoveries with their colleagues. And that was found to be quite sufficient at the initial stage. But as you know now, obviously, we have a lot of different genres within the scientific style or academic writing, and they all serve quite often rather specific and I would say rather narrow purposes. Well, think about academic articles, think about textbooks, or think about your own research papers. Yes, I remember that's not the word I should be mentioning too often, but I hope you have an opportunity to continue your own academic research without, well, as you don't need to go to the university. Okay, and finally, the fourth conditioning factor for the development of functional styles was, I would say, somewhat surprising. But again, if you think about it, it makes sense if you think about this. This was individual and communal choice. So individual and communal choice as the fourth factor conditioning functional styles. Obviously, we quite often think that individual contribution would be rather limited in terms of functional styles. If you think, for example, about the sheer volume of academic publications nowadays, you would think that one scientist, one author, is not very likely to affect the overall functional style. But I would say still, certain individual or communal preferences in the selection of linguistic materials can still affect the overall functional style. Because there are periods in the development of functional styles when the writers experiment with the means that they have at their disposal, and certain means become preferred over some other means, and thus the functional style can be formed. Obviously, well, these days probably this process is less noticeable, but still it is quite possible that certain, for example, constructions can be preferred or can be rejected by a certain community using certain linguistic means for communication. Right. Now, our next point that we have to talk about today will be the style features. Here we talk about different ways of describing functional styles, different, I would say, different patterns which can be followed in the description of all the functional styles without being sort of too subjective, creating some kind of underlying network of parameters for the description. So, in general, every functional style is characterized by a number of features. And these features or properties or characteristics can be linguistic and extra-linguistic. So these characteristics can be linguistic or extra-linguistic. The extra-linguistic characteristics of the functional style are supposed to be described as style features. So extra-linguistic characteristics are supposed to be described as style features. And for the first time, this idea was suggested by Professor Schneider in 1959. So this term, this idea was suggested by Professor Schneider in 1959. Further, this approach was developed by a Russian researcher, Professor Kozhina, who subdivided style features into primary and secondary. So she subdivided style features into primary and secondary. By primary style features, she understood predominant specific features. So predominant specific features conditioned by extra-linguistic properties of a style. So by primary style features, she understood predominant specific features conditioned by extra-linguistic properties of a style. For example, if we look at the style of official documents, the primary style features for the style of official documents will be prescriptive, mandatory, and impersonal character. So the primary style features here will be prescriptive, mandatory, and impersonal character. And another feature here will be precision. Precision. Among secondary style features for the style of official documents, we can single out such a feature, for instance, as conventionality. Conventionality. As for style markers are actually language properties which are attributed to a functional style. So style markers are language properties which are attributed to a functional style. For example, we can remember that in certain functional styles, we can find a large number of passive constructions, or we can find parallel structures typical of some of these functional styles. We can talk about certain predominance of very complex sentences with various subordinate clauses and other constructions precisely expressing the relations between ideas, and so on and so forth. Or on the contrary, we can talk about some styles which will have quite a small amount of complex sentences and would rather be characterized by simple sentences and the use of contracted forms, for example. So different markers are more likely to be found in different functional styles. Right. Okay. Now, closing up all this previous discussion, I'm going to give you the definition of a functional style. And after that, we'll talk about the classification of functional styles. So, first of all, the definition of the functional style, which we may use in our discussions. So, a functional style is a specific form of language variety. So, a functional style is a specific form of language variety that serves to provide adequate means for communication, that serves to provide adequate means for communication in different spheres of human activities. In different spheres of human activities. And that is usually conditioned. And that is usually conditioned. So once again, from the very beginning, functional style is a specific form of language variety that serves to provide adequate means for communication in different spheres of human activities, and that is usually conditioned. Okay, right. Doing time-wise. Just enough time for a little bit of classification. Time to exercise your fingers if you were, I don't know, typing or writing or whatever you were doing, or I don't know, recording notes. It's up to you, right? And our final point that we're going to talk about today is called the taxonomy of styles. Taxonomy of styles. Taxonomy. Taxonomy of styles. As you know, I like clever words. If you don't want to use the word taxonomy, you can use the word classification. It's the same thing. But we have to learn new words. Sometimes it's kind of more fun. There are several classifications, and these classifications can differ. And the difference in classifications is determined by the underlying principles on the basis of which the functional styles are determined, or on the basis of which the functional styles are singled out. Just a second. No, I'm not trying to advertise the coffee. It's just I need a sip of liquid because I've been talking for so long. So we have, as I said, a number of classifications of functional styles in the English language. The first one we're going to start with is the one offered by Professor Galperin. It's not chronologically first, but it's important for us, again, as he is the founder of our Department of English Stylistics in this university. So he singled out 5 functional styles. He only singles them within standard written English, and that's important. So he singled out his functional styles within standard written English. And these functional styles are as follows. So we have the bell letter style. The bell letter style, remember the French spelling, quite a lot of words, quite a lot of letters, not all of them are pronounced. Then we have the publicist style. The publicist style. The newspaper style. The style of scientific prose. The style of scientific prose, and the style of official documents. So we have 5 functional styles. Professor Nair followed Professor Galperin's classification, but he added one more functional style. He added the so-called technical style. Which included all sorts of manuals and operational instructions for various, for example, devices or mechanisms or equipment, various kinds of equipment, which of course would make sense because they are not exactly what you would expect to find in the style of scientific prose. They should be given, or it makes sense if they're given their own functional style. They would have their own specific principles of writing and organizing texts. Right. Then one more classification was proposed by Professor Arnold. Professor Arnold. She singled out the same functional styles as Professor Galperin, but she also added one more variety, which is not standard written English, and which she called the style of conversation. So you see that here there is discrepancy, I would say, between the two approaches. Professor Arnold did not restrict her classification of functional styles just to the written variety. She also singled out the spoken variety as a specific functional style. Although, as you can see, it's not always acceptable to a number of researchers to speak about the style of conversation. Because, okay, on the one hand, of course, we have a very specific sphere of human communication which needs its own means. But on the other hand, we have such a great variety of means in spoken conversation that sometimes it's very difficult to actually come up with a certain list of characteristics as all people can have their own individual characteristics of spoken speech, and it's very difficult to say whether these are individual features or whether these are part of the general spoken variety of the English language. And of course, we can't expand a functional style indefinitely. We can't say that anything goes into the functional style, right? Because where's the border then, right? Where do we say this is correct or not correct, belongs here, doesn't belong here? So this is something that researchers obviously are arguing about. Anyway, the classification exists, and this is how it differs from that offered by Professor Galperi. Also, of course, there are other possibilities. For example, David Crystal and David Davy, and of course, you know David Crystal, our ever-present, omnipresent English researcher, singled out other varieties of language, or other functional styles. I would say the most noticeable was the style of religion, which, of course, as you would imagine, in the Soviet period of research into the functional styles, probably would not be something that would be singled out, even though, of course, it existed, but I don't think it received that much attention, to be honest, right? But of course, they also spoke about other varieties, and this is due to the fact that the language continues to develop. People develop new areas of activities, and these areas may require a specific variety of language for communication. And obviously, new functional styles may continue to appear. For example, we can talk about the chat style, and I see obviously a very good example to the right of my screen here. Or some researchers are talking about singling out the information technology style. Again, describing certain typical linguistic features. So we can talk about the style features and style markers typical of the new varieties of language, and therefore we can single out new functional styles. Well, which is kind of normal for the language because, as we said, society keeps developing, the language keeps changing, and the new freshly created linguistic means do need to be given some academic attention. Right. Okay. Now, I think this is where I stop. Right. I've spoken about everything I needed to mention in our today's lecture. As I said, once again, if you joined a little bit later, because the organization was not not ideal, I would say, at the moment. I apologize for that. Anyway, as I said, I'm thinking of what to do about those stylistic devices that you are assembling or have assembled. So obviously it's easier to deal with the ones which have already been assembled and checked. I need to think how to process the new additions, right? I will try to email some information concerning the devices and our continuing work. I will say that we have more lectures because I'm not quite sure when this distance education will end, but we can make use of the facilities offered by the university and obviously not have everything in just written or typed format, but also have things delivered via the online, I don't know, direct streaming or whatever it is, live transmission. And also we need to sort out what to do about those who fail to get a credit in winter, because unfortunately that also presents now a considerable problem for everybody, including the students. But as I said, again, I'm working on trying to figure out how to come to some kind of satisfactory conclusion of that kind of unfinished business with a continuous credit, and not only in the English language, but in any other subject if you have similar issues, right? Please let me know by mail if you have any questions after today's lecture. And also I would like you to send me data about who was listening, because some of you obviously come up with some lovely pseudonyms or group names or whatever, and I would like to obviously know who I managed to reach, right? As I have a feeling that my screen is telling me 37 people are present. Okay, but please drop me a line on email, and I, at the moment, guess I'm saying bye-bye, right? Bye. Right. And I hope you can go on to doing other classes if you have anything coming up after me, or if you can just go and proceed with your homework and preparation for other subjects. Okay, so that's it from me. Bye-bye.